The discovery. The morning light spilled across the tall glass facade of Hallberg International, painting the lobby in golden streaks that mingled with the hum of hurried footsteps, murmured conversations, and the constant shuffle of employees starting another manic Monday. Executives rushed in with phones pressed to their ears. Interns fumbled with files they were desperate not to drop, and middle managers clutched their coffee cups like lifelines, their minds already consumed by deadlines and reports. It was the kind of scene that repeated itself every week, a carefully orchestrated chaos that kept the global firm moving. And as always, in the background of this moving machine were the men and women who kept the building running quietly and invisibly. The cleaning crew, the custodians, the people whose names were rarely remembered even though their presence was felt in every polished floor and spotless pane of glass. Among them was a woman in a burgundy uniform, her hair tied back in a simple ponytail, her cart neatly stacked with sprays, cloths, and a mop bucket. Her name was Denise Atwater, and though she appeared to blend into the rhythm of the lobby, fate was about to reveal just how little anyone had ever truly noticed her. Jonathan Kellerman, the CEO of Hallberg International, was a man who prided himself on structure and detail. His days began with meticulous precision, his schedule often timed to the minute, and he rarely let anything catch him off guard. He had led the company through expansions in Europe, secured contracts in Asia, and held his ground against fierce competitors in South America. To the outside world, he was the picture of success: sharp suits, steady hands, and an aura of command that made people lower their voices when he entered a room. But on this particular morning, as he strode through the lobby on his way from the garage to the executive elevators, something unexpected broke through the noise and caught his attention. A voice, not loud but commanding, rich with tone, rhythm, and confidence. It wasn't just the sound that made him pause, but the language itself. Mandarin. He knew it instantly, the cadence unmistakable. He had spent enough time in Shanghai offices and Beijing boardrooms to recognize fluent Mandarin when he heard it. And here, echoing softly in the middle of a busy lobby in Fort Worth, Texas, was a janitor speaking it as though it were her mother tongue. He slowed, his polished shoes clicking against the marble as his eyes scanned the room. At first, he assumed perhaps one of the international sales representatives had come in unusually early. But when his gaze landed on the source of the voice, he froze. Standing by the touchscreen directory, gesturing kindly to an older Chinese gentleman in a navy jacket and thick-rimmed glasses, was Denise. He had seen her before, many times in fact. She was always there after late-night meetings, pushing her cart down the silent corridors, nodding politely if someone acknowledged her, fading into the periphery like background music no one paid attention to. She was polite, discreet, and, he admitted now, entirely invisible to him until this moment. And yet here she was, holding a conversation in flawless Mandarin, her hands moving gracefully to emphasize her directions, her voice calm but precise, and the man before her nodding with visible relief as if she had just lifted a weight off his chest. Jonathan's curiosity deepened as he lingered, careful not to intrude too quickly. He wanted to see if this was a fluke, perhaps a memorized phrase or two. But before he could analyze further, Denise finished with the older gentleman and smoothly turned her attention to a delivery worker holding a clipboard. Without hesitation, she slipped into Spanish, her tone rolling fluidly as she explained where to leave the packages. The man blinked in surprise, then smiled, muttering a grateful "gracias" before shuffling away. Jonathan's eyebrows rose slightly, and before he could even process that, she shifted again, this time addressing a vendor who was muttering under his breath at a stack of mislabeled boxes. Her words slipped into French, crisp and unbroken, her faint smile accompanied by a pointed finger directing him toward the correct conference room. The vendor's shoulders loosened instantly, his irritation dissolving into gratitude as he followed her guidance. Jonathan felt his jaw tighten, not from anger but from something sharper, something he hadn't felt in a long while: shame. Here in his building, a woman who had been polishing floors and emptying trash for over a decade had just displayed the kind of linguistic ability he would have paid a consulting firm 6 figures for, and she had done it in the span of 5 minutes as casually as breathing. He stepped forward then, unable to ignore it any longer. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady but tinged with intrigue. Denise turned, startled but composed, her eyes meeting his with that same professional neutrality she always carried. Yes, sir, she asked softly. He offered a faint smile. That was Mandarin, wasn't it? She nodded. Yes, sir. And you speak it fluently? Yes, she answered simply. And Spanish? And French? Again, she nodded, her expression calm without a trace of arrogance. Also Portuguese, German, Arabic, Italian, Swahili, and I read Latin, though I don't really count that. Jonathan blinked, his carefully organized morning schedule evaporating in the face of what he had just heard. You're telling me you speak 9 languages? She did not hesitate. Yes, sir. Her tone was straight, neither boastful nor self-deprecating, just matter-of-fact, as though she had said nothing unusual at all. He studied her carefully, noting the steadiness of her eyes, the way she did not fidget or scramble to justify herself. This was not a woman inventing a story. This was truth. Clean, undeniable truth. What's your name? He asked finally. Denise Atwater. Miss Atwater, he continued, his curiosity swelling into something stronger. Are you free for a few minutes? She hesitated, not with fear, but with the subtle caution of someone who had spent years being overlooked. Someone who instinctively questioned sudden attention. Now? She asked. He nodded. Yes, I'd like to talk to you in my office. For a second, she searched his face, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly as if to measure the sincerity of his request. Slowly, she gave a small nod. All right. He gestured toward the elevators, holding the door as she stepped inside. The ride upward was quiet, but heavy with something unspoken. Denise broke the silence first. I've worked here for 13 years, she said evenly. He turned to her, caught off guard by the calmness of her confession. Never thought I'd be invited up. Jonathan allowed himself a faint, thoughtful smile. You might be surprised how quickly things can change, he replied, though even he had no idea how much those words would come to mean. When the elevator dinged and the door slid open onto the executive floor, he knew instinctively that this morning had just shifted the course of more than one life. As they walked through the polished hallway that smelled faintly of leather and citrus, Jonathan's assistant glanced up from her desk, her eyes widening at the unexpected sight of the janitor walking beside him. He gave no explanation, simply nodding for her to let them through, and ushered Denise into his glass-walled office. The space was immaculate, dominated by a world map peppered with colored pins, a tray of espresso cups gleaming on a side table, and family photos nestled among awards from international trade conferences. Denise sat carefully in the chair he gestured toward, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze calm but observant. She did not gawk at the lavish surroundings, nor did she shrink into herself. She simply sat, as if she belonged there all along but had never been invited to prove it. Jonathan leaned forward across the desk, his eyes fixed on her. So, Miss Atwater, I'll be honest. I didn't expect to be having this conversation today. She gave a small nod, her face unreadable but steady. But I just heard you speak 3 languages in under 2 minutes, and I need to understand. How does someone like you end up here cleaning floors? For a moment, silence hung between them, thick with possibility. Denise's eyes drifted toward the massive window that overlooked the skyline, then back to him. You got time for the truth? She asked quietly. Jonathan's answer was immediate. I wouldn't have asked otherwise. She exhaled, rubbing her palms together slowly, as if preparing to pull memories out of storage. All right then, she said, her voice firm. The truth it is. The backstory. Denise sat across from Jonathan in the tall glass office, her hands folded together in her lap, her posture calm but steady, and her eyes carrying that quiet resilience only people who had lived through storms and survived could wear without speaking a word. The morning sunlight spilled through the windows, casting a glow across the map behind Jonathan's desk where pins dotted continents like trophies of past expansions. Yet in that moment he found himself less interested in the geography of his empire and more fascinated by the woman sitting in front of him. He had led negotiations with presidents of multinational corporations, argued terms with ministers of trade, and dined with foreign dignitaries, but never had he felt the distinct hum of curiosity and humility he felt now, listening to a janitor who had just casually listed 9 languages as if they were household chores. When he told her he wanted the truth, she nodded once and began, her voice carrying the evenness of someone used to holding back but now ready to let some of the truth spill. I was born in Toledo, Ohio, she said, her words slow, deliberate, her eyes not on him, but on the faint reflection in the glass window. as if she was speaking to a younger version of herself standing somewhere in that reflection. Only child. My dad worked as a pipe fitter, the kind of man who came home smelling like steel and grease. His hands always rough, but his laugh big enough to fill a room. My mom was a nurse's aide. She worked double shifts at the hospital, always tired but never too tired to remind me that books mattered. They didn't have much, but they had this belief, this unshakable faith that if I studied hard enough, if I worked long enough, I could climb out of the neighborhood and make something of myself. Education was the closest thing we had to religion in my house. Sundays might have been for church, but every other day was for learning. Her voice didn't waver, but Jonathan saw the faintest trace of emotion pass across her face when she said it, the echo of a father's laughter and a mother's encouragement lingering in the air. She leaned forward slightly, her palms pressing together as though bracing herself to keep going. I was good at school. Not just good, I loved it. I loved words most of all, the way they built bridges between people who thought they had nothing in common. I picked up Spanish from neighbors and kids at school, learned French from an old set of cassette tapes my mom found at a thrift store, and once I started, I couldn't stop. It was like a hunger I couldn't feed fast enough. By the time I graduated, I had tested into advanced courses, won scholarships, and got a full ride to Kent State University. I majored in linguistics because to me, languages weren't just tools. They were stories, they were cultures, they were entire ways of seeing the world. I was halfway through a master's program, dreaming about teaching or maybe working for the State Department, when life took a turn I didn't plan for. She stopped for a moment, drawing in a breath so deep it seemed to scrape across years of memory. Jonathan didn't interrupt. He knew enough to recognize when silence wasn't emptiness but space, a space people needed to step across before they could keep walking. My mom got sick, Denise continued after a pause. Cancer. It came fast and hard, and I couldn't stay away. I left school, came home, took care of her. My dad, well, 6 months later, he had a stroke. Just like that, both of them were gone. The foundation I had, the reason I thought I could build something higher than where I started, it crumbled in less than a year. Suddenly I was alone, and not just alone, I was broke, grieving and responsible for myself in a way I wasn't ready for. And then came my daughter. Her eyes softened slightly, the first break in her otherwise steady demeanor, the kind of softness that only entered when someone spoke of their child. Her name's Lila. She's the reason I kept going. Her father, well, he didn't stick around. By the time she was born, he had already disappeared, leaving me to figure out how to keep the lights on, how to keep formula in the cabinet, how to pay for doctor's visits and bus fare. I didn't have the luxury to chase dreams anymore. I just needed survival. That's how I ended up working every job I could find. Grocery stores, nursing homes, temp agencies, whatever kept us afloat. Jonathan sat back slightly, the weight of her story pressing into him like a stone. He had heard countless stories of resilience, especially when negotiating abroad, but rarely had he heard it in such plain, unvarnished language. Denise wasn't dramatic. She wasn't begging for pity. She was laying down the truth like bricks, one by one, solid and undeniable. She continued. Eventually, someone told me about a custodial supervisor here at Halberg who was hiring. Night shifts, steady pay, flexible enough for me to pick Lila up from school and still cover rent. I figured, why not? It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work and it kept us fed. That was 13 years ago. I've been here ever since, pushing this cart, mopping these floors, emptying trash cans while executives walk past me like I'm part of the wallpaper. And you know what? I made peace with it. I stopped expecting anyone to ask who I was or what I knew, but I never stopped learning. While my daughter slept, I read newspapers in 5 languages. I borrowed old textbooks. I listened to recordings online. I practiced every day because it mattered to me. Because even if the world forgot me, I wasn't going to forget myself. Jonathan found himself unable to break eye contact with her. Her voice was not filled with bitterness. Instead, it carried a kind of quiet dignity. The kind that came from surviving storms without ever advertising the scars. He realized in that moment how easy it had been to assume, to see the burgundy uniform, the mop bucket, and stop there, to not ask, to never look closer. And yet here she was, a woman who had enough linguistic skill to rival the consultants he flew in from overseas, sitting across from him after over a decade of cleaning the hallways of his empire. He let the silence stretch for a moment, heavy with meaning, before finally asking, "Why didn't you ever apply for something else?" A translator's role, an administrative position, anything that could use your skills? Denise gave a small shrug, her expression steady but tinged with something almost weary. It's hard to dream when your rent's due. Opportunities don't knock when you're invisible. And people don't tend to believe the janitor when she says she can speak 9 languages. They assume. Always assume. So I stopped telling anyone. I just did my job. Her words lingered in the air, echoing louder than the hum of the city outside the window. Jonathan felt a knot tightening in his chest, not just from guilt but from recognition. The recognition that he, too, had walked past her countless times without ever seeing her. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming lightly against the desk, his mind already racing in directions he hadn't considered when he stepped into the building that morning. "Miss Atwater," he said finally, his voice slower now, thoughtful. "You've just told me one of the most remarkable stories I've heard in years. And I don't think it ends here. Not anymore." Denise tilted her head slightly, not skeptical, not hopeful, just waiting. She had learned not to put weight on words until actions followed. Jonathan knew that, and it made his next thought all the more urgent. For the first time in a long while, the CEO of Halberg International realized he had underestimated the greatest talent in his building, and it hadn't come from a headhunter's file or a competitor's office. It had been here all along, pushing a cart in silence. The test, the next morning, dawned like any other at Halberg International, with the lobby buzzing with the familiar orchestra of hurried footsteps, clipped voices, and the low hum of machines running in the background. But for Jonathan Kellerman, CEO of the company, the day carried a weight of unusual anticipation. He had spent the night turning over in his mind the conversation with Denise Atwater, the janitor who had sat across from him in quiet dignity and revealed that she was fluent in 9 languages. 9. The number kept echoing in his head like a drumbeat. He thought about every international expansion meeting, every costly translator flown in, every contract negotiation that had hinged on cultural nuance. And then he thought of Denise, pushing her cart through the hallways overlooked for more than a decade. He could not let it rest. He would not. By the time the sun had fully risen, Jonathan had already decided he was going to put her to the test. Not because he doubted her, but because he wanted everyone else to see what he had seen, to witness for themselves what had been hidden in plain sight. He called his assistant into his office, his tone brisk but not unkind, and gave instructions for the afternoon meeting. The company was hosting a group of international partners, a small delegation from 3 countries, Brazil, Germany, and Morocco, who were arriving to discuss logistics for a major joint venture. Typically, a team of translators and consultants would be present to manage the language gaps, but Jonathan made a bold decision. This time, he asked his assistant to quietly hold the translators back until he gave the word. When she raised her eyebrows in confusion, he gave a faint smile and said, "Trust me, I have someone else in mind." That was all. He didn't explain further, not yet. He wanted the moment to unfold naturally, to strike with the kind of impact that words alone could not deliver. Meanwhile, Denise had no idea what awaited her. She went about her usual morning routine, wiping down the polished chrome of the revolving doors, checking the paper stock in the restrooms, mopping the corners where footprints had collected. She did her work with the same quiet thoroughness she always had, unaware that the CEO himself had made plans that would soon thrust her into the very center of the company's spotlight. Around mid-morning, Jonathan approached her in the hallway, his presence once again catching her off guard. She straightened immediately, setting her cleaning rag aside. "Good morning, sir," she said politely. Jonathan smiled faintly, his expression steady but with a glimmer of something more. Anticipation, perhaps, or determination. "Miss Atwater," he began, "I need a favor. Something a little unusual. Are you free this afternoon?" Denise hesitated, her brow furrowing slightly. "Depends on what you mean by free." "My shift runs until 6, he nodded. "This is during your shift. Well, let's just say it's work I think only you can do." Her eyes narrowed slightly, cautious but curious. "What kind of work?" He leaned in just enough to soften his voice. "A test, an opportunity. I want you to sit in on a meeting today. Don't worry. You won't have to pretend to be anyone else. I just want you to be exactly who you are, but you'll understand more when you're in the room." She studied him for a moment, her instincts pulling between skepticism and trust. Finally, she nodded slowly. "All right, if you're sure." Jonathan gave her a small, reassuring smile. I'm very sure. By mid-afternoon, the boardroom on the executive floor was prepared, the long glass table polished, the company's best coffee and refreshments laid out. Representatives from Brazil arrived first, their Portuguese flowing quickly as they exchanged greetings. Next came the Germans, their clipped consonants filling the air with formality. Finally, the Moroccan delegates entered, switching between Arabic and French as they made small talk. The atmosphere was polite but tense, as it often was in such meetings, the weight of millions of dollars in future trade hovering over every gesture. The translators, waiting just outside the glass doors, shifted in place, ready to be summoned. But Jonathan hadn't called them in. Instead, when the moment was right, he gestured toward the far end of the room where Denise entered quietly, her burgundy uniform crisp, her hair neatly tied back, her expression steady, though her eyes betrayed the flicker of nerves. The delegates looked up in confusion. Some of the executives at the table frowned slightly, whispering to each other. What was a janitor doing here? Jonathan raised his hand lightly, silencing their murmurs. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice calm but commanding. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce someone. This is Denise Atwater. She's been with this company for over 13 years, and she speaks 9 languages. For a long moment, the room went utterly still. Then one of the Brazilian delegates chuckled politely, assuming it was a jest. But Jonathan's expression remained firm. Miss Atwater, he continued, perhaps you could greet our guests from São Paulo. Denise's spine straightened almost instinctively, her hands folding neatly in front of her. Then, without a beat of hesitation, she turned to the Brazilians and spoke in flawless Portuguese, her tone warm and respectful, her words flowing with the rhythm of a native. Their eyes widened, surprise flashing across their faces as they exchanged delighted nods. She didn't stop there. She asked about their flight, complimented the beauty of their home city, and even referenced a local festival that had taken place just the week before. The Brazilians laughed in delight, their skepticism melting instantly. Then Jonathan shifted his gaze. And perhaps, he said softly, our German friends as well? Denise turned smoothly to the other side of the table, her words slipping into precise, formal German, her tone crisp and respectful, acknowledging each of them by title. The Germans, who had arrived with a reserved demeanor, broke into smiles and murmurs of approval, impressed by not only her pronunciation but her command of nuance. Finally, Jonathan gestured toward the Moroccan delegation. Without missing a beat, Denise switched to Arabic, her voice carrying the lyrical flow of the language, greeting them with the traditional phrases of respect. Their astonishment was immediate and palpable, one of them leaning forward with genuine excitement as she carried on in both Arabic and French, weaving seamlessly between them as though she had lived among them her entire life. The boardroom, once filled with skepticism, was now hushed in awe. Executives who had been whispering in doubt minutes earlier now sat stunned, their eyes fixed on Denise as she navigated languages like a conductor guiding an orchestra. Even the international delegates, men and women accustomed to high-level negotiations, were visibly impressed. Jonathan allowed the moment to breathe, watching the transformation sweep across the room before speaking again. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just witnessed is the kind of talent that cannot be measured by resumes or job titles. Miss Atwater has been part of this company for over a decade, working quietly in the background, unseen by many of us. Today, she's shown us what true value looks like when it's finally recognized. His voice was steady, but inside he felt a swell of pride, not for himself, but for her. For Denise, who had just shattered the assumptions of everyone in the room. The rest of the meeting unfolded with Denise at the center, not just translating but facilitating, her ability to shift between languages allowing subtle cultural nuances to be smoothed over before they could become misunderstandings. She didn't just translate words, she conveyed tone, intent, and respect, earning the admiration of everyone present. By the time the session concluded, the delegates were smiling, shaking her hand warmly, some even requesting her personal contact for future discussions. The board members, though too proud to admit it aloud, exchanged glances that betrayed their shock. Jonathan noticed, and he didn't miss the silent acknowledgement that they had all overlooked her just as he had. Denise, for her part, accepted the gratitude and praise with calm humility, never boasting, never drawing more attention than necessary. She was who she had always been, steady, grounded, and quietly remarkable. When the meeting finally dispersed, Jonathan lingered by the door as Denise prepared to slip out. He stopped her with a simple, "Miss Atwater." She turned, her eyes meeting his, her expression still calm but carrying the faintest flicker of something new. Recognition that she had been seen, truly seen. Perhaps for the first time in years. Jonathan gave a small nod, his voice quiet but firm. That was extraordinary, and it's only the beginning. Denise tilted her head slightly as though measuring whether to believe him. Then she gave a small nod in return. She didn't say thank you, she didn't need to. The look in her eyes said everything. She had waited a long time for this moment, and now that it had come, she wasn't going to waste it. The struggle, the applause of that afternoon still echoed faintly in Jonathan's memory as he sat alone in his office later that evening, the skyline of Fort Worth glowing like a constellation beyond the glass wall. The image of Denise standing at the head of the boardroom, navigating 3 languages in seamless succession, lingered in his mind like a scene from a play he could not stop replaying. Yet even as pride swelled in his chest, a shadow of unease crept in. He knew this company, knew its culture, and he knew not everyone would embrace what had just happened with open arms. Halberg International was vast, but it was also rigid. It was an ecosystem built on hierarchies, resumes, credentials, and long, predictable ladders of advancement. Denise had bypassed all of that in one afternoon simply by being who she was, and that meant some people, especially those whose authority rested on protecting the status quo, would see her as a threat. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, already preparing for the inevitable resistance. The backlash came faster than he expected. The next morning, whispers circled through the executive floor like smoke after a fire. Senior managers gathered in small knots near elevators, lowering their voices as they discussed the janitor incident, as some called it. A few dismissed it as a clever stunt by the CEO, a one-off trick to impress the delegates. Others, more skeptical, wondered aloud if Denise had memorized rehearsed lines and was being exaggerated into something she wasn't. But the most cutting comments came from those who felt their authority had been undermined. In a closed-door meeting, one of the directors, a man named Robert Hensley, who had been with Halberg for over 2 decades, voiced what others were thinking. "Jonathan," he said, his tone firm, "we can't just pluck a janitor out of the maintenance department and parade her as some kind of savant. It's unprofessional. What kind of message does that send to the employees who spent years climbing the ranks? That we don't care about qualifications? About credentials?" His words were sharp, but Jonathan noticed the edge of fear beneath them. It wasn't about professionalism. It was about control, about the discomfort of someone rewriting the script of what success was supposed to look like. Jonathan listened, but he did not flinch. "Robert," he replied evenly, "what message does it send if one of the most talented people in this building has been ignored for over a decade because of the color of her uniform? Denise speaks 9 languages. 9. That's not a parlor trick, that's a gift most of us can't even fathom. If our company prides itself on global reach, how can we justify overlooking the very person who embodies it more than anyone else in this room?" His words silenced the room for a moment, but Jonathan could see from the set of their jaws and the narrowing of their eyes that the battle wasn't won. Some of them would dig in deeper. Some of them would resist, not because Denise wasn't qualified, but because her very presence disrupted the comfortable assumptions they had built their careers on. And Jonathan knew Denise herself would feel the weight of that resistance most heavily. Denise, for her part, felt the shift almost immediately. Where once her colleagues on the custodial staff greeted her with easy familiarity, now they looked at her with a mix of pride and distance, unsure how to treat someone suddenly thrust into the CEO's orbit. On the executive floors, she felt the sting of eyes that lingered too long, of whispers that stopped when she walked into a room. In the cafeteria, some smiled at her with genuine admiration, but others gave curt nods that carried an undertone of skepticism, as if silently reminding her she had crossed an invisible line. At first, she tried to shake it off. After all, she had lived 13 years being invisible. She could endure being scrutinized. But the difference now was sharper. Being unseen had been painful, but being seen and doubted was something else entirely. It was like standing on a stage under harsh lights with no script, waiting for someone to decide whether to applaud or boo. Jonathan called her into his office a few days later, noticing the heaviness in her shoulders when she entered. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Denise gave a faint smile, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. I'm fine, she said softly. He studied her face for a moment. That's not what I asked. I asked how you're holding up. She exhaled, sinking slightly into the chair across from him. It's strange. For years nobody noticed me. Now everyone does, and not all of them kindly. Some think I'm pretending. Some think you're just using me for a show. And some don't think I belong anywhere outside of a mop bucket. I can feel it in the way they look at me. Jonathan leaned forward, his tone quiet but firm. Do you believe you belong? Her eyes flickered up to his, steady and unflinching. I know I belong, sir. I've known it all along, but knowing it and proving it are two different things. The words settled heavily between them, and Jonathan realized that while he could shield her from some of the politics, Denise would have to walk through the fire herself. And perhaps that was exactly what would make her triumph undeniable. The true test came sooner than either of them anticipated. Just a week later, Halberg International hosted a preliminary negotiation session with a major East African distributor, a deal that had been in the works for months. The translators scheduled for the session were delayed due to travel complications, and murmurs of postponement began to ripple through the executives. Jonathan seized the moment. He turned to Denise, who had been invited as an observer, but had sat quietly at the edge of the room, and asked, Miss Atwater, would you be willing to step in? The room stiffened instantly. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes flashing with disapproval. Robert Hensley muttered under his breath, This is absurd. But Jonathan ignored them. He looked only at Denise. Her heart pounded, her palms tightened against her knees, but she nodded slowly. Yes, sir. And with that she stepped forward. What followed was not merely translation, it was transformation. Denise addressed the East African delegation in flawless Swahili, her tone respectful and her knowledge of local customs evident in every phrase. When cultural idioms arose, she didn't stumble. She explained them gracefully, ensuring both sides understood without losing nuance. The visiting executives, visibly relieved, leaned forward with growing trust, their guarded expressions softening into genuine engagement. Meanwhile, the Halberg board members, who had doubted her, sat frozen as they realized the janitor they had dismissed was doing what even their most seasoned negotiators sometimes failed to do: build trust in real time. By the end of the session, the delegation expressed admiration not just for Halberg's proposals, but for the woman who had made the entire meeting possible. One of them even remarked in English, "Your company is fortunate to have her." Jonathan caught the flicker of discomfort on Hensley's face and the grudging resighs of others. He knew then that the tide was shifting, slowly, painfully, but inevitably. That night, as Denise left the building, she walked past the polished glass door she had cleaned 1,000 times before, her reflection following her into the dark parking lot. She paused, looking at that reflection, the burgundy uniform still wrapped around her shoulders. She knew it would take time for the world to see her differently, but for the first time in years she also knew the battle wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about transformation, not just for herself, but for every unseen hand that had ever worked in the shadows of greatness, waiting for someone to notice. And though the struggle was far from over, she felt a quiet certainty in her chest as she climbed into her car. The struggle was the proof, and the proof would lead to triumph. The triumph 2 weeks after Denise had stunned the East African delegation with her effortless command of Swahili, Halberg International prepared for what was being described internally as the most significant negotiation of the year. A consortium of European and Asian partners, representatives from France, Italy, China, and Japan, were flying in to discuss a joint venture that could potentially reshape the company's global logistics network. The stakes were enormous. Hundreds of millions in projected revenue, new markets, and a reputation that could either soar or falter, depending on how well the talks went. The translators had been scheduled, the consultants prepped, and the board members rehearsed their pitches. But Jonathan Kellerman had a different plan in mind. This time there would be no waiting, no hesitation, no backup plan tucked into the corner. He had decided that Denise would not merely participate, she would lead the cultural and linguistic bridge of the entire negotiation. And he was determined to make the board, the delegates, and even Denise herself see what he had come to understand. That true talent, once revealed, could no longer be hidden. The boardroom was alive with tension that morning. The long glass table gleamed under the soft overhead lights. Water pitchers stood beside neatly arranged pads of paper, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and citrus cleaner. Executives shifted in their seats, murmuring among themselves, their voices carrying a mix of doubt and curiosity. Robert Hensley, still vocal in his disapproval, leaned toward a colleague and whispered something sharp, his eyes flicking toward the door as if daring Jonathan to push this experiment too far. Jonathan, however, sat at the head of the table with calm authority, his gaze fixed on the entrance. When the doors opened and the international delegation filed in, the room grew quiet. The French delegates spoke softly among themselves. The Italians gestured with animated hands. The Chinese representatives exchanged deliberate glances, and the Japanese visitors maintained composed silence. The swirl of languages filled the air, a reminder of the vast cultural chasm that needed bridging, and then Denise walked in. She no longer looked like just another member of the cleaning staff, though she still wore the burgundy uniform. She had chosen not to abandon it, not yet, because to her it symbolized where she had come from, the years of invisibility that had brought her to this very moment. Her hair was neatly tied, her eyes steady, her expression calm but purposeful. When she stepped into the boardroom, the murmurs quieted. Some board members shifted uncomfortably, while the delegates looked curiously at the woman who had just entered. Jonathan stood, his voice firm but measured. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "before we begin, allow me to introduce someone very important to this meeting. This is Denise Atwater. She has worked with this company for 13 years and she speaks 9 languages. Today, she will be facilitating our discussions." The shock in the room was immediate. The French delegates raised their brows. The Italians leaned forward with interest. The Chinese whispered softly among themselves, and the board members, several of whom still doubted, stiffened visibly. But before skepticism could take root, Denise began. She turned first to the French delegation, her voice slipping into flawless French, greeting them formally but warmly, weaving in cultural references that immediately made them smile. She spoke not just the language but the rhythm of their culture, the small courtesies that revealed she understood more than words. She understood them. Then, without pause, she shifted to Italian, her tone bright and melodic, addressing the Italian partners with warmth and enthusiasm that mirrored their own expressive gestures. They laughed in approval, clearly delighted to hear their language spoken with such fluency by someone they had not expected. From there, she turned to Mandarin, her voice measured and respectful, acknowledging the Chinese representatives with precise phrasing and cultural deference that left them nodding in quiet admiration. Finally, she addressed the Japanese delegates, her tone composed, formal, and deeply respectful, her Japanese crisp and steady, her bow delivered with perfect timing. The room was silent for a moment after she finished, the weight of what they had just witnessed settling over everyone like a wave. And then, the transformation happened. What could have been a fractured, tense negotiation dissolved into something else entirely. The delegates leaned in, eager, engaged, and open. They no longer needed to wait for translators to catch up or fear that nuance would be lost. Denise was not merely translating words. She was weaving cultures together, ensuring that intent, respect, and subtlety carried across every language. She explained metaphors that might have been misunderstood, softened phrasing that might have sounded harsh, and elevated moments of connection by offering small cultural references that only someone deeply immersed in language would know. Within an hour, the room that had once seemed poised for stiff formality was alive with genuine dialogue. The French delegates smiled as the Italians laughed, the Chinese leaned forward with curiosity, and the Japanese nodded in agreement. Deals that might have taken days to untangle were moving forward in hours, all because one woman, once invisible, had stepped into her own light. Jonathan sat back in his chair, watching it unfold with quiet pride. He saw the disbelief on the faces of his board members slowly melt into awe, even in Robert Hensley, who could no longer deny what was in front of him. And more than once, Jonathan caught the delegates glancing at him with an expression that carried its own unspoken message. Your company has something extraordinary. By the time the meeting ended, hands were shaking. Agreements were outlined, and the first drafts of contracts were already being sketched. One of the French delegates turned to Jonathan and said, in English, "You do not need translators here. You already have one of the finest in-house." Another, from the Chinese group, remarked, "She is the reason this meeting succeeded." Jonathan only nodded. his eyes shifting toward Denise, who accepted their gratitude with quiet grace, her humility never faltering even as admiration surrounded her. When the room finally cleared, Jonathan asked Denise to stay behind. She stood by the window, the city sprawling behind her, her reflection cast in the glass like a shadow of her past, standing beside her present. He approached slowly, his voice low. "Miss Atwater," he said, "what you did today, I don't think this company will ever forget it." She turned to him, her eyes steady, her expression calm but carrying a trace of something deeper. Pride, yes, but also relief. Relief that after years of invisibility, after countless nights scrubbing floors no one noticed, she had finally been seen for who she truly was. "I didn't do it for the company," she said softly. "I did it because this is who I am. Languages are what I know, what I love. It's the only part of me I refuse to let the world take away." Jonathan nodded slowly, his respect for her deepening even further. "And that," he said, "is exactly why the world needs to hear you." Not just this company, the world. In the weeks that followed, Denise's role at Hallberg transformed. She was officially promoted to lead a newly created department of cross-cultural communications, tasked with training staff, supporting international deals, and representing the company at global conferences. The story of her discovery spread quietly at first, then widely, becoming something of a legend within the industry. Articles were written, not about Hallberg's financial growth, but about the janitor who had been overlooked for 13 years before changing the course of international negotiations. Employees who had once walked past her without a glance now greeted her warmly, not with pity but with genuine respect. And though Denise still carried herself with the same quiet humility, there was a new steadiness in her stride, a light in her eyes that spoke of a woman who had reclaimed her own worth. For Jonathan, the lesson was permanent. He realized that leadership was not only about charts, numbers, and strategies, but about seeing people, not just their titles, not just their resumes, but their humanity, their hidden strengths, their untold stories. And for Denise, the triumph was not only in her new position or the recognition she received, but in the knowledge that she had not been erased by circumstance. She had endured, she had persisted, and when the world finally turned its gaze upon her, she was ready. Ready not only to speak in 9 languages, but to speak for every unseen worker who had ever been underestimated. Her story became more than her own. It became a reminder that greatness can wear any uniform, that brilliance can hide behind humble tasks, and that sometimes the most extraordinary voices are the ones the world almost forgot to listen to. And so, as Denise stood at the podium months later, addressing an audience at an international conference, her voice carrying effortlessly across microphones and translations, she paused for a moment to remember the long nights pushing her cart down empty hallways, the years of silence, the countless times people assumed she was no more than what they saw. And then she smiled, because now they were listening, and she would never be invisible again.